Oh, Kat Brady is here, and Henry Curtis is here. So basically, there were smarter people in the audience than are sitting in this chair right here. So this is a very Akamai audience. You guys follow the legislature. We're hoping to not tell you, the very basics on how to introduce a bill, but kind of get to the nitty-gritty and what's most important. Let me introduce my panelist. To my left is Representative Sylvia Chang. She is chair of the House Finance Committee. Senator Karl Rhoads is chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee. On my far left is Josh Wisch. He is the head of the ACLU of Hawaii. You guys all know this, I recognize that. And to my far right is Janet Mason from the League of Women Voters. A round of applause for our guests today. I'm going to start with breaking news, and I'm going to ask Sylvia and Karl, and I'm going to call them Sylvia and Karl, if that's okay. I think I've known you well enough, long enough. Breaking news, it is the number one story on our website, Marcel Honoré. It's number one, I think, in the city and state. Honolulu rail officials repeatedly fed the public rosy estimates that contradicted their own internal warnings of the project's runaway cost and crippling delays. That's according to a much anticipated state audit that was released 2 hours ago. It is the first of 4 that are expected from State Auditor Les Kondo in the coming weeks. And of course, that was part of the rail funding bill that the House and Senate passed with the GET and the TAT. I did want to give Sylvia and Karl a brief moment to comment. I know you probably haven't read the report, given that it just broke and you've been busy, but Sylvia?
Okay. So as Chad just stated, this is just one of 4 audit reports, so this will not be all encompassing. For instance, this audit report is just a historical perspective, so it might be something that many of the audience members and many of the news individuals like yourself, and especially people like Marcel, who's been working on this issue forever, is probably these are facts that they're probably aware of. The second audit will come out next week. The second audit will be a description of the structure of HART and how that in itself is, depending on what the auditors say, whether that caused problems or issues. The third audit, which is expected at the end of January, that's where it gets a little bit more substantive, and that will talk about, I believe, either change orders or some type of other issues. And then the last one, the culminating one, will be the 4th one in the middle of February. And we just want to thank the auditor's office, because actually there was another one anticipated, and they're having issues about whether the auditor himself felt whether the report was sufficient enough. So, as you can see, Les Kondo and his office is doing a lot of work to bring transparency and accountability and really faith in the largest public works project in the state of Hawaii.
Karl, I know that, if I'm not mistaken, we were talking earlier, the rail line would actually go through your district, Evelay, basically? And
all the way through. Yeah, I think there's 4 stops in my district.
Reaction, I know, again, you haven't read the report, but I just...
Well, my reaction is just it's the number one rule of public communication is to get the bad news out there yourself before somebody catches you. And I just am appalled that they would go that route. Having said that, I don't think it should be used as an argument to stop the rail project. I think it should be an argument to improve the management of the rail project. But it would be like saying, well, we don't like the current president of the United States, so we should get rid of the presidency. No, you should get a different president. So I think if personnel needs to change to keep that kind of thing from happening, then so be it. But I still firmly believe that rail is a necessary and beneficial project in the long run.
One quick follow, my understanding of the legislation that was passed in special session, you could revisit the funding mechanism, is that correct?
We can revisit the funding issue at any point, because after all, this is the general excise tax. In addition to that, it was the hotel tax, the transit accommodation tax. So because the authorization is given by the state, the legislature could revisit the issue at any point. If I could just add one
Sure.
more thing. So one of the things I think The auditor's office and the auditor continues to tell me, okay, I have become everyone's friend, where people I have never known come up to me on the street and stop me and tell him all these little bits and pieces and problems that they have with rail and other issues. And the number one thing that people come to talk to him about is the rail route. And so whether, if you have an opinion about stopping the rail at Middle Street, or whether it should be going to UH where that was the promise that was initially made, or, whether it should move Mauka or a different route. Actually, the auditor's office wanted to tell everybody he is not looking at the rail route. So please do not stop him at Starbucks or Safeway, because none of the audits will deal with the rail route. With that said, I personally do feel that the current rail route is wrong. I think we have an obligation, just like all the state departments, to look at climate change. And if we have a responsibility to invest a lot of our state funds and taxpayer money, the rail route should change to inland, so that we can anticipate that if we're gonna make an investment, we have to plan for the future. And this is really not just about rail, but it's about transit-oriented development. What future developers and homeowners are we going to force to live in the flood zone? And so I think this is something that, we may or may not take up, but it's something that, as audience members and taxpayers, I think we need to continue to do critical thinking about rail, and continue to push individuals who are in charge of this project to continue to challenge themselves and rethink about what is the best thing for the citizens of the state and citizens of Oahu.
Okay. Anything else, Karl?
Well, Chair Luke is correct. Because the city and county didn't approve the charter amendment that would allow us to put more people on the auditing board, we have every right to go back and revisit it. The route, I couldn't agree with more. I tried to talk the Hanneman administration into moving it in Mauka. Gosh, it's been 11 years ago when they were first looking at it, not because of climate change, but because the way rail ridership works is you want people walking to the rail stations from both sides, and if you get down near the water, there's nobody living in the water, so you can't have somebody walking from that side. Having said that, it's very, very difficult to change the route at this point. I think you basically just start over again. You do a new EIS, you have to get back in line at the federal level if you expect to get any money. I doubt seriously the Trump administration is going to do us any favors, whereas the Obama administration, when Senator Inouye was chair of the Appropriations Committee, they were doing us some favors. So it's a very difficult decision that way. I mean, the other thing you got to look at is how long the thing will last. So you figure it's going to last 100 years. Are the parts of the parts through my district in Ivalai and Chinatown, are they going to be underwater in 100 years? Well, some of them probably will be. I guess I'm happy. My last statement would be, I guess I'm happy that I didn't get my way about putting it underground, because at least it's above the water and we won't have to worry about that part.
Thank you. Again, only because of the breaking news, given the hard audit, and you heard the latest. So here's how it's going to work. I'm going to give each of our panelists just a couple minutes of what's top of mind for them as the session begins. It opens next Wednesday officially. I'm going to follow up with a few questions, and then I'm going to take questions coming over. Already, I've got the first question. You're not going to believe what it is. How do you plan to fund public education? Well, we'll get to that in a minute. Second question, are there chances for a $17 an hour minimum wage? But don't answer that just yet. So I'm first going to turn to Sylvia to briefly tell us what's on her mind in terms of the House and the session in general.
Okay, so before I start, I wanted to recognize one of our newest legislator, Amy Peruso in the back. Stand up, Amy, since we introduced other members, and if I'm missing any other
You're so
House
new, I didn't
member-
recognize you. I apologize.
No.
My bad.
So, I think one of the things that we really need to address is public education. What was really what was really obvious during the election cycle when the entire debate about using property tax for education came up, you got the sense from the public that the public supported public education and public supported the funding of public education. But the reason why there was so much skepticism in providing additional funds for education, including use of property tax, was not because people didn't support it, but people did not have enough confidence in the department that they are using the funds that they currently have in the right way. And regardless of what the superintendent is saying, that 94% of tax dollars are going to the classrooms, I would say majority of the people in this room and majority of the people do not believe that figure. So it is really upon us as policymakers and you as the public and the department to show accountability and to make sure that the dollars that we're investing in education, which is close to $2 billion a year, it's about $1.7 billion, that those are leading to transparency, accountability, and results by our kids. So I think that's one of the big focus for the next session.
Let me ask one follow-up question on this. One of the main arguments of the anti-Con Am folks who were successful in defeating it was that there's money in the DOE that we just haven't seen. Let's have a forensic audit. You look at those books. You're the finance chair who has to approve their, as you say now, $1.7 billion, sometimes $2 billion budget. Do you think there's piles of money hiding somewhere? Because Corey Rosenly from the HSTA says, no, that's not the case at all.
So one of the things that our committee does is we look at the budget of every department, all the 17 departments. And I hate to say this, but other than the University of Hawaii, Department of Education is the only department where the finance staff and the committee cannot get into their system. So we have asked them repeatedly, and it's not just this superintendent. It's, the prior superintendent is, all the prior superintendents. We have asked them repeated again and again, can we get into your system so that we can at least match up the numbers and say, hey, how much is going to the schools? And the way that the Department of Education budget is put together, it's a mystery, and we do our best. Yeah, sorry. I don't want to build more skepticism in this debate, but the way that they formulate their budget. So for instance, let's say, Department of Health, we want to see how many epidemiologies there are, how many people are looking at disease control, and we know exactly how many people there are and how much we're paying and what's the deliverables, what are they doing. So we know we can track those things. For Department of Education, all those things are lump sum groups. So we have EDN 100, which is it's school support, what is known as weighted student formula. And already I'm boring you guys, I can tell. And then you have, that's only EDN 100, and then you have EDN 150, which is special education budget. So it's all grouped together, EDN 200, EDN 300. So I keep telling the department, even prior to this administration, that that budget doesn't make sense. I want to see how much is going to Roosevelt High School versus Kealakehi or Lihue or what? How can the public go in and say, hey, how much is being spent at McKinley High School for Dumpty Dum amount for all these things versus another school? And that's just something so difficult. You would think
I'm not sure I understand.
obvious,
This is
but that would be so
taxpayer dollars. How on earth can that be hidden from the people that approve their budget?
Right. So we continue. So I just met with the superintendent, I think about a couple weeks ago, and I told her, no, it's terrific that you're making progress in being more transparent. But one of the things we would really like to do is get into your system. And part of the next step is making sure that that system is available to the public, where you can click in and say, hey, Dumpty Dum amount is being spent for McKinley High School and for these things.
Okay. Have you tried a public records request?
Maybe,
You got to hire Brian.
yeah, maybe he can.
I have other questions, but I do want to turn to Karl. Karl, what's on your mind as we go into session? You heard already one of our first questions. Thank you for addressing education. Was the minimum wage? I think your idea would be to tag it to inflation. But what's on your mind as you're looking particularly ahead as a judiciary chair?
Well, I think the sort of overriding issue, the issue for years from now, for years and years and years, is going to be climate change. And
That's one of our questions too.
I'll only be water land chair for another 6 days, so I will not have the institutional position that I had last year or the last couple of years. But it's already happening. It's very difficult decisions. How to get people to quit using less carbon is a huge issue, a very difficult one. Whose house to let fall into the water and which ones not to let fall into the water is another very difficult issue. But it's going to happen, and I don't, there's just no getting around it. The high-end estimates of sea level rise are now getting up into the 8 to 10 foot range, and you think about that, and that means this building, I don't know, I guess this building would still be safe at 10 feet, but downtown is in danger, and Ala Moana Center the parking lot's got 2 feet of water in it. So, and if you look at all the highways around the Oahu, even already on the windward side, you can get hit with waves as you drive down the road. And moving those roads back, very expensive, very controversial, because you're going to have to condemn people's land. So I anticipate that for every session from now until the day I die, global warming is going to be a big issue. Minimum wage, well, my main objection to minimum wage is that every year you leave it the same. If there's any inflation, it actually falls, and I don't think that's fair. So I will be putting in an indexing bill. For reasons that I have never completely understand, the body has always been very reluctant to index anything, not just minimum wage. I guess you could make the argument that we're giving away some authority, but if 3 years from now it looks like the minimum wage is just a disaster because of where the index has sent it, we still have the authority to step in and say, okay, we're going to change it. So I think at the very least we should have some sort of a long-term plan that the anticipation is that it will go up by a couple of % every year, just so that the actual rate doesn't go down. From my perch at JDC, I think the stars are pretty well aligned to do all mail-in voting. I'm not absolutely positive about that, but I think it's likely. We're going to do Kauai in 2020, and I think we probably will go statewide with that shortly thereafter, 2022 or 2024. It's not a silver bullet for turnout, but right now we're basically running 3 separate systems: early walk, day of voting, and 55% of people are already doing absentee ballots. So it's kind of a waste of money to run all 3 systems, and we can't find anybody to work at the polls on election day anyway. So at some point something's got to give, and it probably does save us about $800,000 each cycle. So that's nothing to sneeze about either. What else? Asset forfeiture is one that a lot of people in this room are probably familiar with. I think that the public at large is becoming more familiar with. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, if you're suspected of being involved in a crime, the law enforcement can take your assets. You don't have to be convicted. They can just take them and sell them. And that to me seems really unfair. I'm kind of surprised that we haven't had a lawsuit about that already.
Josh?
We're watching.
But anyway, there's as JDC or finance chair, there's always a billion different things that
Sure.
come up, but those are the ones that are sort of spring to mind right away.
Just a quick follow-up, only because this question comes from my boss, and it does involve a lawsuit that the Civil Beat Law Center was successful in, and it regards something a lot of people don't know about, and I'm going to botch it, but it's a deliberate process privilege. Do I have that right, Patty? Do I have the acronym correct? Basically has to do with OIP, the Office of Information Practices, and agencies being able to deny people filing public records to get information. And it's a privilege, and the High Court struck that down. Brian, that was a very layman's translation, but is that more or less correct? Okay, the question I have for Sylvia and Karl before we go to Janet and Josh is, will you try and rewrite state law in order to address the court ruling?
As one former judge chair to a former judge chair and soon to be JDC chair, my inclination is to wait and see. My understanding is the procedural disposition is that the Supreme Court kicked it back to the trial court. My inclination would be to wait and see what they actually come up with at the trial court level to see what we're dealing with, because there may be other privileges that apply, or I just don't know how much of an effect it will have until we know what the final outcome is. But other lawyers may have different opinions.
I think we have a lot of important issues that we need to cover, and this is not something that we are anticipating doing anything about.
Okay, thank you. All right, let's get to others. Before I forget, speaking of minimum wage, Randy Ching, are you still here? Are you still with the Sierra Club? Yeah. This is a plug for a living wage launch, which happens today in this very room. Is it 329? Okay. At 4:45 today, it involves the Hawaii Appleseed and a new group called Raise Up Hawaii to a Living Wage. This is not an endorsement from Civil Beat, but I wanted to let you know about it. They're going to be passing out petitions, flyers, and talking about rallying the Capitol. So there's a plug. There are flyers outside on the table. So, all right, let's continue. Janet, tell us briefly about what the League of Women Voters does and what's on your mind going forward in the session.
Okay. The League of Women Voters, our basic motto is protect the right to vote, encourage everyone to vote. But in truth, our agenda is a lot broader than that. We have a terrific committee this session that's going to be preparing testimony on many of the issues that you mentioned: environment, criminal justice, anti-poverty measures, and so forth. But our priorities are still very much in the elections and voting area. The first priority is a simple idea. It's called automatic voter registration.
Tell us about automatic voter
Okay.
registration.
The basic idea is that people are automatically registered to vote when they go to obtain or renew a driver's license or get a state ID. Because all the information that's needed to vote is already contained on your application for a driver's license or a state ID. So you would be automatically registered unless you decline, unless you opt out. Why do we support it? There's still probably as many as 64,000 people out there that we think could be helped by this process. Also, it's very efficient. It's going to be an electronic transfer of data from the Department of Transportation to the Office of Elections. In the long run, it's going to save us money. Like vote by mail, it's probably not a huge amount of money, but because it reduces the labor costs for handling all of these records, it is going to be a savings of, I don't know, maybe $3 a record. So that in the long run, that adds up. Our second priority is something that's been in the news indirectly a little more lately, and that is mandatory recounts for close elections.
Why would that be important?
Okay. The League believes that we're already in good shape to do these mandatory recounts because we have processes whereby we have paper ballots already. We have ballot reconciliation going on. We have security procedures for securing the paper ballots, and we have independent election observers. So when there is a close vote, either between candidates or on ballot measures, it's important to keep the public's confidence up that there has been a fair use of voting procedures and an accurate count of the vote. Hawaii is a minority. 40 states already have some kind of provision for recounts, and more than 20 states already have some aspect of a mandatory recount procedures. It shouldn't be necessary for a candidate to actually sue the state Supreme Court to get a recount. This isn't a good use of the court's time, and we are very confident that, in fact, our Office of Elections can already do this job if it's required by law. So we're going to support the mandatory recount.
And by the way, I should bring up another issue as well. Obviously, Matt Lupresti lost his case to Kurt Favela, the new GOP senator. Still pending is the Trevor Ozawa, Tommy Waters case. I understand there's a new development today on that, but we'll get to that at another time. I do want to correct something on my part. I believe Nancy Devlantes, I don't know if I identified you properly. You're with the League of Women Voters of Honolulu. Is that correct, Nancy?
That's right, but we were the plaintiff.
And that's the other thing I'm going to correct. You, in fact, are the plaintiff on the Guttin Replace legislation. Do I have that correct? Hey, I'm getting better at this. And Janet, are you a plaintiff as well?
Well, indirectly, it's the League of Women Voters of Honolulu. That's
Can you
the
tell us where
plaintiff.
we are with that? Brian Black is also the attorney. I'm not
Sure.
shamelessly plugging Brian today, but that service is open to everybody, even though it says Civil Beat Law Center. It is independent. But where are we? I believe there's a hearing coming up soon on that case. Do you know?
Okay, here I'm going to refer to my notes because it's a little messy.
That's fine.
Okay. The League filed a lawsuit in the Circuit Court concerning Act 84, which was passed last session. This was a bill relating to public safety. That was the title of the bill. When the bill was introduced, it was a measure that required annual reports on recidivism in the Department of Public Safety. That bill passed, let's see now, it passed in the Senate and then it crossed over to the House. When it got to the Committee on Public Safety, the committee deleted the contents of the bill and they replaced it with something that is entirely different, which was a measure to have hurricane-resistant, schools. Okay, here is our complaint with this bill. It is very specific. We are complaining about Act 84. There is a state constitutional provision which requires that each bill have one subject. And by the time this passed, through the legislature and the governor signed it, there was definitely more than one subject in that bill. Secondly, our Constitution, and we all want to respect the Constitution, it requires 3 readings of the measure in the Senate and 3 readings in the House. Why is that? Our elected representatives are supposed to have sufficient time to discuss and debate the bill. And they didn't, because after the bill passed in the House, it never went back to the Senate. We have been complaining about this for a long time. The League does not like to resolve disputes with litigation, but we felt as though we had no choice. We complained about this in testimony. We had petitions to the House and Senate in, I believe, 2014, lots of op-eds in the paper. Nothing has happened. We think that the state legislators are deprived of their rights to make laws and debate on different bills when this kind of maneuver takes place. And that's how it's.
Thank you, Janet. Brian, when is that hearing?
January 24th at 2 o'clock.
Okay, Sylvia and Karl, correct me if I'm wrong, but the legislature has actually filed a brief in this case. Would you like to respond why Guttin Replace is not a bad thing?
So it's not to say Guttin Replace is not a bad thing, or even the term of Guttin Replace, but one of the things that the legislature does is we are here for 90 days or 60 days, 60 working days, which translates to about 4 months. And a lot of times things come up and we need to act quickly. So that's why when we first heard about the lawsuit, I thought, okay, I know exactly what bill they're talking about. And it turned out to be wrong, because the bill I thought was the most egregious violation, and we were very aware of it.
What bill number is that?
I don't know what the bill number was actually the Kauai flood relief bill. So it was a bill that I think dealt with, either EITC or rainy day, or, it had a broad title called relating to budget. And it wasn't a bill that was passed last year. It was a bill that was sitting in either conference committee or somewhere along the lines. And then on April 20th, major flood happened on Kauai, and people were going, okay, you know what, something needs to be done. And this bill actually had no public hearing, no public testimony. No, it didn't even go through any committee, so it didn't have any hearing, and we just put it out of another conference committee. We just took out everything from that bill, and which was kind of a 2-sentence bill, and put in the $125 million for relief. And out of the $125 million relief, the governor used part of that money not only for Kauai, not only for Oahu, but then they also used it for lava relief. Let me give you another example. So that's why I was kind of surprised. I was like, oh, okay, yeah, that one was kind of bad, but Kauai really needed the help, Oahu needed the help, and that was even for ourselves. If we did that all the time, that's something that I think both Karl and I would have a problem with, but it was extraneous circumstances which required that flexibility for us to move quickly. The second example is the homeless bill. So the homeless bill, there were about a dozen homeless bills. At the end, one homeless bill passed. The homeless bill had $50 million in appropriation. It had $30 million for Ohana Zone, plus other type of rapid rehousing, plus ER diversion. But some of those issues never came up, and those things were pulled from different bills to make it one bill so that we can have one homeless bill. Which is actually, Josh Green's bill, to show that it has to be a comprehensive approach. So even that in itself is a violation under this current lawsuit. The other example is the affordable housing bill. Affordable housing bill, people talked about, okay, we have to put in a huge amount of rental housing trust fund. So affordable housing issues, it was going along. And in conference committee, without any public testimony or without having any remnants of the rental housing subsidy, we said, okay, we are gonna make a huge investment, $200 million, we're gonna grab that and then put it into the bill. So all those bills, if it was only about that one single bill, I wouldn't have a problem, but as you know, court has a broad jurisdiction over many of the bills, and I think our problem is that if it was to just say, okay, that one bill should get struck down as unconstitutional, I wouldn't have a problem with that. But if it leads to other bills being struck down, then the consequence is, for me, I'll be happy, because you know what? We are going to have so much money because, all the collective bargaining bills, some of the executive budget bills, all those are invalidated. So we would actually have about $100 billion dollars. So we can pay for rail.
Got it. Mayor Caldwell, are you listening? This is not live, by the way, but if I didn't make clear earlier, we will be packaging clips from this and posting it on our website, I think our Facebook page as well. Karl, quickly, Guttin Replace, your position?
I understand why. I understand what makes you unhappy. There's a number of, I don't use this word very often, so opacicities in the system where you can't really tell what's happened.
What is an opacity?
It's an opaqueness.
It's a black hole.
You can't see through it.
Got it.
And even as a longtime practitioner of the dark arts of politics, there are still times when things die and I have no idea why they died. And I'm in the process, so I'm very sympathetic to the notion of you in a democracy, people need to be able to see what's going on. Guttin Replace doesn't strike me. It's a matter of degree. I mean, we almost very rarely does a bill pass without being amended, and sometimes the amendments can be pretty substantial. So my standard practice is if we're really going to change the bill a lot. I'll post a notice for the hearing notice. Will have a copy of whatever it is that I'd like you to comment on. Sometimes that's not possible. We are only in session 4 months a year, so I do understand what Sylvia is saying too, because there are times when the substance becomes more important in the process. I think a lot. Unfortunately, I think there are times when we we don't make it easier for the public to know what's going on.
Okay. I have a request from the audience. Move the mics closer to your mouths, please. I see that is delayed. I apologize for not getting to that sooner. Josh, tell us what the ACLU of Hawaii is and what it does. I think most of us in this room know, but let us know anyway.
I appreciate it. First of all, is the mic close enough to my mouth? Okay, going for my late night love songs and dedications radio voice here. Okay, so I'm with the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union of Hawaii. And for anyone who doesn't know, the ACLU has been around about 100 years nationally, and we've been around for about 50 years here in Hawaii. And really what we do is we make sure that everyone's rights are protected under the law and under the Constitution. And that is the short version. That's what we do. Some fun facts, for instance, one of our founders was Helen Keller. Not too many people know that one. I didn't know that one until I started, but I always thought it was kind of interesting. Some of the things that we don't do, we don't endorse candidates in any party. We are completely nonpartisan. We are nonprofit. We are in no way affiliated with the government, which I found out a lot of people are surprised by that. So just let me say again, we are in no way affiliated with the government. No offense to our government friends here at the table. And we don't take a dime of government money, which also allows us to be a government watchdog and hopefully a pretty effective one. And some of the things that folks might know about what the ACLU does probably come from the Supreme Court cases you might be familiar with. Quick show of hands, anybody know about your Miranda rights? Anyone? Okay, Miranda, ACLU case. For anyone here in Hawaii especially who might happen to be married to someone who is of a different ethnicity, Loving versus Virginia, ACLU case.
Not until the late 60s too, right?
Yeah, really darned late. So that one's another ACLU case. And locally, some of the cases we've worked on include everything from making sure that people who want to marry someone who they love, regardless of their sexual orientation, can do that. We've worked on prisoners' rights. We've worked on LGBTQ rights. We've worked on reproductive rights. But it's also not just the cases. We basically do work in three buckets. One is the litigation. That's what most people know us for. We also do a lot of advocacy work, which is why we're here at the Capitol. And we also do a lot of public education work. So those are some of the things that we work on both locally and nationally. Also locally, one thing I'm just kind of a little bit excited to say, just selfishly, is we're building up our capacity here in Hawaii right now. So I'm not sure, Mandy, are you anywhere here? Are you in the audience? So back there, Mandy Fernandez. She is our policy director as of about 72 hours ago.
Congratulations.
She just started working with us. Mandy used to be with us as Mandy Finley as our advocacy coordinator. Recently got married, so again, mazel tov, Mandy. In addition to Mandy, next week we have someone starting with us as our Smart Justice campaign director. And that's going to be a full-time position working on criminal justice reform. And the reason I mentioned some of these additions is that we're really gearing up because of a lot of the issues that we see here in Hawaii. What the ACLU does is we see things through a lens of the Constitution, and we see things through a lens of protecting people's civil liberties. And I'll briefly talk about a couple of the big things we're working on, but just from a personal standpoint, one thing that I can tell you is I've been on the job for about a year now. January 2nd or 3rd, I think I hit 1 year. And while I'm mildly embarrassed to admit this, I think I'm probably not the only one who could say this. After just 1 year on the job, I'm actually kind of surprised by the number of civil liberties violations we've seen across the state. And it's not just here on Oahu, it's all over the place. So a couple of the big ticket items that we're working on, and Chad, I'll address these briefly because I think you said you might want to ask some questions about some of these.
Just one or two about some of those cases you mentioned, but please continue.
One is Title IX. So for anyone who doesn't know about Title IX, it's the Education Amendments of 1972. It's something that was co-authored by our own Congresswoman Patsy Mink. Back when I was in government service, I actually got to work for Patsy when I was a young pup in law school. I interned for her in Congress, so this one's actually a little bit personal to me. And it basically demands that there is gender equity in education across the board, not just in sports, but that's what it's really known for. And earlier in 2018, Civil Beat wrote an article about this. Suvan Lee, I don't know if Suvan's anywhere in the audience, but Suvan, if you're watching, hello and thank you, because we have quite publicly acknowledged that the ACLU became aware of this problem locally because of Suvan's article, that the Department of Education was not treating female athletes equally to male athletes. And we sent a demand letter to the Department of Education in February of 2018, not demanding that a bunch of athletic locker rooms got built overnight, but just demanding that there actually be a plan to comply with the law that's been in place since before I was born, to make sure that the Department of Education was treating women equally to men. And we worked for about 10 months to try to make some progress there, because like Janet, litigation is our last resort, just as it is with the league. Unfortunately, after about 10 months, we got nowhere, and so about a month ago, we filed a class action lawsuit in federal court, listing a number of the ways that we think that girls are not being treated equally to boys in Hawaii high schools and other schools. And it doesn't just deal, by the way, with funding, just because I know that funding education has properly been brought up as one issue that the legislature is going to be looking at. That's part of it, but that's not all of it. We saw that female athletes aren't getting as much practice time. They're not getting equal coaching time. Their sports are not being advertised as well as the boys' sports. And one example, our plaintiffs are water polo players who had to start practicing on the land because the school hadn't found a place for them to practice. And when they complained about it, the school threatened to completely cancel the program and started withholding funding for it. The legal term for that, of course, is retaliation. And to put it mildly, you can't do that. So we filed a lawsuit against the Department of Education, and right now their response is due to us in 8 days. So that's one thing, and I'll be quiet about that so Chad can ask any questions later. Just a couple of quick other things. Smart Justice. I mentioned that we have a Smart Justice campaign director beginning with us next week, and Hawaii is part of a nationwide Smart Justice campaign that the ACLU is doing, and the point of that campaign is to reduce mass incarceration by 50% and deal with racial inequities in the system. And there are a number of different parts of this campaign: bail reform, probation reform, parole reform, prosecutorial reform, re-entry. What the ACLU of Hawaii is starting to work on is bail reform. We put out a report about this in early 2018, and we're going to be putting out a revised, not really a revised report, but kind of an updated report relatively soon. Let me briefly say, when we talk about bail reform, because not everybody is dealing with this all the time, what bail is something that is supposed to make sure that somebody returns to court. And really, that's all. It's supposed to make sure that somebody returns to court, that public safety is ensured while those folks have to return to court, and that people's civil liberties are protected as part of that process. It's not supposed to be about punishment, but really that's the way it's being treated here in Hawaii, to the extent that about half of our jail population consists of pre-trial detainees who haven't been convicted of the crime they've been accused of committing. They're sitting in jail because they can't afford to get out. Hard stop. And so that's one of the things we're working on. And just so that for any skeptics out there who are thinking, well, you're the radical ACLU lefty, of course you're saying that. There have been a couple of legislative task force reports that have been released in about the past 2 weeks. One of them has been specifically on pretrial detention, and one is about the criminal justice system more broadly and about the construction of a jail. Some of the things that have come out of those task force reports have noted, one of them I think said mass incarceration doesn't work. And that we need to go to a system that is rehabilitative, not punitive. Once again, not me speaking. This is the legislative task force that included judges and prosecutors and all of those kinds of people as well. And so that's something that we're going to be working on this session. And one of the reasons our updated report is going to be a little bit delayed is because the legislative task force report has come out. We're going to be, we have been looking at that. We're going to look at it some more and make sure that we're addressing that before we put out our final report. And the reason we have this Smart Justice campaign director coming on board is because it's not just about what we do in the courts, and it's not just about what we do in the legislature, but it's really about getting public education and public support to understand why this is important for everybody in Hawaii, and not just people who have been involved with the criminal justice system. One last thing I'll just mention is the issue of people who are unsheltered in our state, kind of the houseless community. I don't know is anyone aware of the kind of string of holiday sweeps that occurred?
The ACLU put out press releases both about a sweep. This is the city and county, New Year's Eve and Christmas Eve. Is that correct?
Yes, because happy holidays, apparently. Yes, this is, because we have Rep. Luke and Senator Rhoads, yes, this was the city doing this one, so not the state. But in all seriousness, what had happened here was the day before Thanksgiving, Christmas Eve and New Year's Eve, at 3 o'clock in the morning, the city decided to go out and sweep people who don't have a roof over their heads, and just basically get them out of sight, really. And we have a number of problems with that. We have a number of humanitarian concerns about that and practical concerns, but once again, we're the ACLU, so our first concern is civil liberties. And we have real concerns about the legality of those actions, especially in light of recent court decisions that have made it crystal clear, including the Ninth Circuit, which is the federal circuit that includes Hawaii and that Hawaii courts have to abide by, including a recent decision from the Ninth Circuit that made quite clear that if you are arresting someone or threatening to arrest them, and the only reason you're doing that is because of their status as someone who is houseless, then you're breaking the law.
Okay.
You can't do that. So that's something, all of these issues are things we're going to be looking at both from a lens of the courts and the legislature and the county councils and public education. And with that, I know we're getting close to the point where
that's
Chad said he
all right.
wanted to take a break, so I will now be
Sylvia
quiet
wants to jump in.
and open it up for some questions.
I do want to, by the way, just give kudos to the ACLU for Kahala Nui retirement community being required to offer medical aid in dying services. Was it a religious discrimination that was?
So technically, what it was a violation of the Fair Housing Act. But basically what had happened was you had a retirement home that sits on land that's owned by the Catholic Church, and the home sent a memo to its residents saying you might be aware of the medical aid in dying bill because it's repugnant to the Catholic Church. You cannot exercise your rights under that law. And typically the ACLU gets involved when there is government action. And this is the case of a private entity, but it was the case of a private entity that was pretty clearly violating a federal law. In short order, Kahala Nui put out a new memo clarifying its position that, of course, residents could take advantage of their rights under the law, and that was something that I think we're happy to see. There's still some remaining questions there, but that was great work, both with people in the community who alerted us to that, as well as to our legal team. And one last shout out, by the way, is also just a shout out to the impact of journalism, both for instance, making things like Kahala Nui, making more people aware of that so that other people in other retirement homes who might have been subject to similar issues could know that they had their rights. And again, for things like Title IX, because frankly, if Civil Beat hadn't written that article, ACLU might not know about the violations that were occurring there, and the lawsuit that we're pursuing might not be happening.
Josh was not paid to make that comment.
I
We're
was
at
not.
the 2/3 mark. We're supposed to go to 1:30. I know Sylvia has a finance hearing. I think Sylvia did want to say something in response to what Josh brought up.
So I wanted to just support what Josh is doing. The legislature has been very critical of the state's I guess, role in corrections. And so one of the things we have made it very clear, many of the legislators do not support the current policy to rebuild the OCCC. Part of the reason is that the OCCC planning and design is being built based on the population they have today. And that's wrong because half of the population, as Josh pointed out, is pre-trial detainees. These are individuals who have not even been convicted yet, and we're building to scale based on the population as of today. Part of the population is 300 individuals who violate whole probation, the whole program, and these are individuals who are trying to better themselves, and they should not be in OCCC. They should be in different type of setting, whether it's some kind of substance abuse treatment center or sex abuse treatment center or something different. The other thing is the OCCC has a lot of detainees who cannot make bail. So these are homeless individuals, or these are low offenders, and these are individuals who just cannot make bail. They cannot pay $100, and so we should not be building to based on what it is. We should take our time, look at the report. One of the things, we just came from the hearing, one of the things that we have learned from our public safety hearing today is that there are 8 current cases pending against the department and the state by individuals who are alleging that the department and the jail system has held on to these individuals after their sentences were done. So these are not the only cases. There have been prior cases before, and there could be other individuals who have been held beyond after their sentence was done. So if you were supposed to be released yesterday, you're still in jail today. And we have talked to the department about corrective action, because when you're talking about civil rights violation, that is a clear civil rights violation, and I have no words to even begin to correct these things. But the problem is a lot of the process is manual. So for instance, you know, the court gives them an order and they go, okay, this person is serving a 10-year sentence. Okay, this person should be out on Dumpty Dump date, but they don't, there's a disconnect between what the orders say and how many days or months they've been in jail waiting for their trial, and that should be a credit. And then if they were out in probation, that should also be a credit. So we're trying to figure out, okay, maybe a different IT system where anybody, including, you know, individual or defense lawyers or even inmates, have access to, and they know exactly when they will be out.
Thank you.
And can I mention
Go ahead.
just one more thing, something that Chair Luke had mentioned about the people who can't afford to pay and maybe $100 and they can't afford to get out. And sometimes it's a whole heck of a lot more than that. The neighbor islands, their bail amounts are not as high as those on Oahu. But of course, the majority of the people who are detained are on Oahu. And the median bail amount for the lowest level felony on Oahu right now is $10,000. I don't personally have $10,000 as kind of lunch money that I'm carrying around. I don't know about any of you. And then if you want to go ahead and use a bond agent, then it's usually about 10%. Now, here's the little known fact. If you are going to pay the full bail amount of $10,000 to the court and you get out, then regardless of what happens when the case is over, guilty, not guilty, you get that $10,000 back. However, if you use a bond agent, and that lets you get out on bond, and you pay that 10%, your case could be dismissed 5 hours later, and you're not getting that money back. That is non-refundable under any circumstance.
Thank you. Your questions, by the way, are being fed directly to my computer, and anyone can interrupt at any time, as you can see. Karl, to you, since you're going to be heading judiciary in 6 days' time, does sentence reform have a chance in 2019? More than 72% of all individuals are serving sentences for lowest offenses, Class C plus and below. Sylvia can answer that as well, but your thoughts?
Well, I think the topics that we've discussed in general are all on the table. I mean, I believe California just got rid of bail bond. There's, I'm not saying this right. Pre-trial, there's not going to be no bail money bonds anymore in California.
Thanks, Kat.
So there's you're looking at other factors to deal with that. I think the whole pre-trial justice reform is ripe for dealing with. I don't think that was exactly your question, though.
Well, sentence reform, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we did.
Particularly for these lower level crimes.
I think it's fair to say right now that you have to, I represent Chinatown, and I have plenty of constituents who have very long rap sheets with lots of minor crimes on them. They never go to jail because there's no space in the jail for them to go to. I don't know. We did a penal code reform task force several years ago, and we passed this gigantic bill that became known as Big Crime. And a couple of the things that we did were to raise the big one was to raise the felony theft threshold. All these phrases that I can't get out of my mouth today. But, you know, things that used to be felonies are no longer felonies because of that, and we hadn't raised it in years and years. So the short answer is yes, but I think some of the work has been done already, and we know a lot of the things that can be done. I would just comment on the prison and the jail/prison situation, though. We still have, if I remember correctly, 1,600 prisoners on the mainland. And for years and years, I think most of us agree that having those prisoners stay here in Hawaii would be better for the prisoners because they can maintain contact with their families. Most of them are going to get out at some point, so you need to have them socialized as much as possible to the conditions they're coming out to. We don't have any place to put them. I'm frankly surprised that ACLU has not already sued us about the conditions at OCCC because when I was judge chair in the House, we passed a bill out of committee anyway that said that the public safety director could release the lowest level offenders because there wasn't any place to put them. We have four inmates in a cell that's supposed to hold one. So I admit to having a little more skepticism about even if we do all the bail reform, I'm not sure that we have enough prison space on Oahu to put all our prisoners in if we brought back the guys from the mainland.
Okay, and that task force that Josh was talking about earlier, one of the things it has argued is bring the prisoners back and do not build a big new OCCC in Halawa. Janet, a question for you, League of Women Voters. There are term limits for the mayor, for the prosecutor, for the city council. How do you feel about term limits for the state legislature?
Ooh, do you think they would pass that? Well, I'm not sure League has a position on that. We would certainly comment on it, but no one should be elected for life. Let's just put it that way. And certainly to keep our public policy, vibrant and to get young people engaged in politics in a good way. Yeah, we want to allow room for growth in the legislature.
Okay.
Yes.
I'm guessing that legislation is not forthcoming.
Well, let me just say, this election, we had a 20% turnover. So we
That's right.
have 10 new members, we have 50 members, one of which is Amy, and then we have, the class that's coming up is, intelligent, and we're counting on a lot of them to be driving policy, and the majority leader who is sitting here, she is heading up the policy committee, of which all the freshman members will be a part of. And I have to say the average year that a legislator serve in the House is about 8 years, and so I'm kind of an anomaly.
Con. Josh Wisch, did the ACLU take a position on the con?
We did.
What was it?
We opposed the con.
Why?
For a few reasons. So one is when you take a look at how constitutions work, both the federal constitution and the state constitution, the federal constitution basically sets a floor for your rights. And state constitution, state laws can go above and beyond that. And Hawaii's does in a number of ways. So for instance, the right to privacy. Everybody like your privacy, generally speaking, right? In the federal constitution, it's in there. It's been interpreted in a number of Supreme Court cases to be in there, cases involving everything from birth control to reproductive rights and more. But in the Hawaii state constitution, it's clearly written into the text of the document. And one thing that we have seen at the national level are a lot of attacks, really, on the right to privacy. And there have been a number of people who are in a position to, for instance, appoint and confirm Supreme Court justices who have said that there shouldn't be a right to choose for a woman as to whether or not to give birth, which is something that's very much rooted in the right to privacy. And if there is something like that that's ever overturned at the federal level, we want to make sure that here in Hawaii, those protections remain in place. And the challenge with the con is that you're opening up the entire document to be rewritten. It's not one constitutional amendment at a time. They're really, you're opening up to the whole ball of wax. You can rewrite the whole darn thing.
Okay.
And right now, that just does not seem like a safe time to try something like that.
Thank you. Cookies and coffee are over there. Help yourself. Open question to the panel. I would like to start a discussion on end-of-life decisions for people with dementia. related diseases similar to death with dignity legislation. Caring for someone with dementia can bankrupt families. I took care of 2 people.
Well, we just passed the compassionate or end of life legislation, death with dignity bill, and I think we need some time to see how we can fix and make that stronger. I think it's premature for us to go and look at other issues, because one of the big issues that came up during that discussion was, we wanted to ensure that someone who is ending their life, it is a personal choice, and in a dementia situation, we don't know if it's their choice.
Okay, Karl, go ahead.
Well, I would largely echo what Sylvia says. I think once you're beyond the point of being able to administer the drugs yourself, which the Death with Dignity bill that we passed requires, it gets a lot murky morally. I suppose you could have some kind of advanced health care directive that says if I get a specific kind of disease and I want you to euthanize me, but that's what you're into, is a euthanization bill as opposed to a medically assisted dying bill. And I was convinced before we passed Death with Dignity that the public was solidly on our side. All the polling said we're on solid political grounds there. I'm not so sure about euthanasia, and I don't know if we ever will be with euthanasia. Having said that, other countries do go farther. I think the Dutch, for example, do have euthanasia laws that work. But I don't know if we're ready or if we'll ever be ready.
Okay, open-ended question to all 4, and maybe I'll ask Janet and Josh first, who often are speaking before the legislature. Tips on what you should and should not do when it comes to submitting testimony you're trying to persuade lawmakers. And then we'll ask Sylvia and Karl. But just give me a do or don't that you've learned over the years.
Let's see. Do be as concise as you can. If you're asking for them to do something in particular, do try to provide wording of how to do that. And when testifying in writing and when testifying in public, do be polite. I swear I'm not saying this just because they're sitting here, but legislators are people too, and they're trying to get a job done. And so do try to respect that when you're appearing before them.
Janet.
Okay, that's good advice. Maybe I'll just add, please don't sit there and read your testimony. It's we know you worked hard on it, but it can be a little boring. Also, you should be prepared to answer follow-up questions from the committee, which happens pretty often.
And sometimes people leave too.
Right.
Sylvia and Karl.
I love what Janet said. Because, we get the testimony the day before, and we provide the testimony to all the members, and I expect everyone who is a member of my committee to become prepared. So that means read the testimony, be prepared to ask questions. So, if you're going through and reading exactly what Janet said, it's actually taking away time from another individual, and sometimes they may have to fly back home, and it's always better to just summarize. And a lot of times, myself included, we think the longer we talk, the more convincing we are. Actually, it's the opposite. The longer we talk, it kind of loses credibility, and then we start thinking, okay, they must not even be convinced because they keep talking. So, that's
Okay.
good advice from Janet.
Thank you. Karl.
The dynamics are pretty tricky. I've always had anybody who sat through any of the 55 hours of same-sex marriage that Chair Luke and I chaired together.
Karl.
We had a 2-minute time limit, and we enforced it pretty strictly because there were thousands of people who wanted to talk. I guess a couple things. One is if the 5 people in front of you have said exactly what you're going to say, then if you don't have anything else to add, it's good to come up, but just say, you know what, I don't want to repeat what everybody else just said. That's exactly what I think. I strongly believe that that's the way things are the way you should go, and let it go at that. After you've read all the testimony and then heard everybody say the same thing over and over again, during same-sex marriage, I could see this kind of an admission. I could see the countdown clock. It was 2 minutes, and I could see it from where I was sitting. And I can't tell you how many times we got to about 20 seconds. I'm like looking over there thinking we're almost done with the 2 minutes. No, still got 1 minute and 40 seconds to go. I knew exactly what they were going to say, And it just, at some point, the repetition is just pointless. So I would say if the people in front of you have stolen your ideas, I'm sorry about that, but there's really no point in going over that again.
We are nearing the end here. It's at about almost 1:20 mark. I do have some closing remarks to make. Maybe at this point, real quickly, all four of you, should lawmakers be allowed to hold campaign fundraisers during session? No. Well, that's what you think. Thank you for offering. Sylvia?
So, you know, I
You
mean,
had one
it's-
yesterday, but that's not technically
Yeah,
during
that's
session. Okay.
So, you know, a lot of times we're trying to accommodate the neighbor island folks, and whether it's before session or after session, my role as finance chair doesn't really end, and I don't really look at how much I get as relating to what I'm gonna do, because I kind of find that offensive. And so, you know, it really becomes a perspective and, you know, what the perception is gonna be, and it's really depending on the legislators to see what they're gonna do. And I know Karl has not never, but, you know, for the most part, he has never tried to hold a fundraiser during session, and it's because, you know, he wants to keep that kind of image and perception as well. So I give kudos to Karl.
So you can thank Chad Blair for me not having fundraisers during session. I got tired of being criticized for it, and it doesn't look good, and that's one reason I've stopped doing it. But you know, the substance of it is I don't think it really matters at all. If you're a legislator who's willing to commit a felony and tell somebody that if you don't give me a campaign contributions, I'm not going to move your bill in lateral, you can commit the felony during the summer just as easily as you commit it during session. So I really don't think it makes any difference, but you know, perception is important, and for that reason, I years ago quit having them during session.
Okay, quickly, Janet or Josh, you want to weigh in on that? Maybe not from the position of your respective organizations, but
I have nothing to add to the comments.
Josh?
I would
it's
just
been
say
covered.
the ACLU does see campaign donations as a form of speech. So I think the tricky thing for us would be just how something like that would be
Okay.
implemented.
Okay.
It would be the devil's in the details.
What I'm going to do is, first of all, tell you I couldn't get to all the questions. I very much wanted to make sure all four panelists were involved, and there are some that were specific to legislation, which I will forward to Sylvia and Karl afterwards. There was stuff on rail, stuff on the DOE, stuff on transmission lines, real estate taxes. We'll make sure they get them, but I very much wanted to include all four. I do want to give a final point to each of our panelists, who, by the way, I think have been terrific. A round of applause. And then I have some closing remarks, but let's go ahead and just anything that you didn't get to say fairly quickly, under a minute if we can. We'll start with Sylvia.
Okay, so I am going to point out two things that I will be working with the Judiciary Chair, and that's actually campaign finance related. So one of them is we really need to do something about Citizens United, and
That was one of the questions.
Trying to deal with the super PACs. I think the super PACs has gotten out of control. I am very disappointed in a certain union that has gone over the top in
Which union,
the
Sylvia?
Carol Fukunaga race, where you had a lot of, I think, you know,
Carpenters Union?
yeah, so those type of pieces went beyond what was okay, because it was just clear out mudslinging, and I think those things have to stop. And you know, we at least, you know, we've been kind of fortunate that it's been local players playing, but you know, it doesn't take imagination for somebody from the mainland to come in and infuse a lot of money and do something about it. So I'm trying to do something creative, and I can share that with Karl at later point, but we have to do something. The second thing is, I think, you know, I appreciate Janet and others trying to increase the voter turnout, but if you look at the general election, a lot of people weren't interested in general election because the people who were running, it was not interesting. And the play in town was the primary, and it wasn't the general. And you know, I know Keali'i is here, and Bart and others who are with the party, but I'm gonna propose a statutory change where you have the two leading candidates go to the general, and then
That could
so-
mean two Democrats
Yeah.
potentially.
So they'll still carry the
In the partisan
Democratic,
races,
yeah. So
yeah.
they'll still carry the Democratic label, but they will have to go to the general. But if you win 50% plus one, then your race is over. And we shouldn't give, free pass to whether it's Green Party, Republican, Libertarian, or the American Shopping Party. I found that out just because that's under a
is an
different
American
party.
Shopping Party.
Yeah.
All
So
right.
it should be
Very
so
good.
I'm
We'll be
gonna-
looking to follow that. Carl, quickly, a final point you want to get across.
Well, I think the whole debate about public financing is the real solution is to do public finance. I mean, to do public financing. The argument against it is you don't want to pay politicians to run for office. That's exactly 180 degrees backwards. That's exactly what you want to do. You want to pay people to run for office because then they're beholden to you, the taxpayer. As it stands, we good politicians will say no to people who've given us money, and I've done it, and I've not gotten their contributions afterwards. But not everybody does, or not everybody's in a strong enough political position to do that. So this whole notion that somehow we shouldn't pay people to run, I think, is nonsense. That's exactly what we should do, is pay people to run.
Okay, Janet and then Josh.
The League strongly supports public financing of elections. We've supported that for years. We have a public financing program, but the limits on what people can get in that program are very low. So we need to take a look at that, and otherwise make it attractive and affordable for all of you to consider running for office.
Josh, final word, and then I'll have just a few brief notes.
Final word, I'd say in terms of protecting civil liberties, it's something that everybody has to be involved with. We're increasing our capacity so we can try to be better about that, but we need people to let us know when there are problems out there. So just one last example, places you wouldn't necessarily expect it, was earlier this year, we helped out a woman in Hilo who was denied getting her driver's license for about a year and a half because she wanted to be able to wear her hijab in the photo, and was told that she couldn't do that because it covered her ears, and was sent to a religious studies professor at UH to prove that she was Muslim enough to wear it. Again, you can't do that. So if there are potential violations out there that people are aware of, or if you have friends or neighbors who may need the help of a place like the ACLU, we give that help for free when we can give it. So please get in touch with us if you know of anybody out there who may be going through such a violation.
Thank you, and a plug for us. We will have 2 more of these cafes, future dates to be announced, but basically in the middle and basically after session is POW, which is in early May. You know this, but here's a reminder. Civil Beat focuses exclusively on the kind of journalism most at risk of disappearing, particularly today. In-depth, investigative, and enterprise coverage of important local issues. While producing this type of journalism is not cheap, you won't find our content behind a paywall. Yay! We also never worry, I like this too, about upsetting advertisers because we don't allow any of them. As a nonprofit newsroom, we rely on donations from readers like you to help keep our stories free and accessible to everyone. If you value our journalism, show us your support by visiting civilbeat.org/donate. I'm Chad Blair. Thank you to Janet Mason, Senator Karl Rhoads, Representative Sylvia Luke, and Josh Wisch of the ACLU. Thank you, everybody.